Okay, well, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's 9 a.m. Welcome everyone to Cheer Presents Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity, SOGI Guidance for Research Screening. Next slide, Jen. My name is Jess Abrams-Schroedel, and I'm a project manager with the Cheer team. I'm joined here today by my wonderful colleagues, Paula Moody, who's also a project manager, and Jennifer Proger, who is the Director of Program and Education for the Cheer Squad. The CHEER team stands for Community Health, Equity, and Engagement in Research. We are a group that focuses on promoting equity in research, not only at the College of Medicine, but all across the university system throughout the Commonwealth of PA. We do that by working closely with researchers, community partners, and community members to try to reduce health disparities and increase wellness in underrepresented communities all throughout Pennsylvania. I do want to note that we do want to hear from you, that the workshop that we're presenting today is the result of interest that we've received on the topic from our participants in previous educational programming. We'll have an evaluation at the end of this program. So we would love for you to give us your perspectives on what future topics you would love to hear about, and we would be happy to try to accommodate those. Next slide. So we are thrilled to announce today that we do have a guest presenter. Our guest presenter, their name is Kay Foley. And I just want to share a little bit of information about Kay's background. Kay Foley, MA, LPC, RYT, is the Executive Director of the Lancaster LGBTQ+ Coalition. The perspective of a somatic trauma therapist and LGBTQ+ advocate positioned Kay to observe deficiencies and degree of support available to members of the LGBTQ+ community in Lancaster. Kay stepped forward to address the problem, find solutions, and begin filling the gap by co-founding Lancaster's first LGBT Community Center in 2019. In addition to their work at the coalition, Kay continues to lead people toward greater health and well-being by providing care as a therapist and yoga instructor. So thank you, Kay. We can't wait to hear from you in just a few minutes. So the logistics for today, we're just going to go through those quickly. The presentation is being recorded. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, you're welcome to ask them at any time. If you could just raise your hand. Please use the chat feature to make comments, share resources, and make connections. We really hope that this can be as interactive as possible. We do have a large group today, but we love when we see the chat, lots of activity going on in there with folks enjoying and sharing information with one another. Also, the presentation materials will be shared with everybody via an email post-session. Live transcription is available. The closed captioning is turned on currently. If you don't need to use this feature, you can feel free to hide it by clicking on the live transcript button and selecting hide subtitle. And then one last thing, if everybody could just check that their name appears accurately in their Zoom boxes, that would be super helpful for us so that we can track attendance. So for our agenda today, we're going to first start out with some background information to kind of create a foundation of what the problem is, which is really the marginalization of the LGBTQ+ community in healthcare and research. We're then going to move on to Kay Foley, who's going to be presenting. We'll follow that by a small group discussion. Then we'll jump into the screening tool that we've developed at CHEER that focuses on collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data in a sensitive and appropriate manner. We will then have panelists with question and answer, and we will introduce you to our esteemed panelists in just a little while. And finally, we'll be providing some resources for everyone to take along with them after the session. Our learning goals for today there are two. Number one is participants will learn examples of how and why the LGBTQ+ community experiences marginalization in healthcare and research settings. And number two, researchers will understand how to appropriately and sensitively complete screening when asking sexual orientation and gender identity, SOGI data with potential research participants. So we're going to go ahead and start with a background. And again, this is just to kind of create a context or a foundation for what the work that we've been focused on in creating the screening tool is based upon. Next slide, please. Thank you, Jen. So we know that the LGBTQ+ population experiences many health disparities. resulting from prejudice and discrimination in their access to healthcare and research. So we're going to just take a few minutes to take a deeper dive into what that looks like with actual statistics. There have been studies that have found that the LGBTQ plus population experiences certain challenges at higher rates than those who identify as heterosexual or cisgender. And because of this, the NIH, or the National Institutes of Health, has actually identified sexual and gender minorities as a health disparity population to encourage and support research in this area. So if we take a look here at this slide, this is a really excellent visual of sexual minorities and health disparities that exist amongst sexual minorities. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but just to give you a few ideas, if we look at the first column there, lesbian women are less likely to receive preventative cancer screenings. If we jump over to bisexual men, they are less likely to be screened for HIV. And if we look at the final column of all sexual minority populations, they have higher rates of alcohol and tobacco use. They experience they're 2.5 times more likely to experience depression, anxiety, and substance misuse. And our LGBTQ youth are likely to more likely to misuse drugs, and 2 to 3 times more likely to attempt suicide. If we move on to the next slide, this continues about health disparities amongst the LGBTQ plus population, but specifically for gender minorities. And again, just to point out a few of these statistics that are really startling. For example, trans women are 34 more times likely to be HIV positive than cis women peers. Trans men are have a lower likelihood of receiving preventative cancer screenings. And for all trans people, about half of trans people report having to educate their providers about their health. And 1 in 5 transgender people delay care because of fear of discrimination. So pretty startling statistics. And then if we turn our lens to research and how the LGBTQ plus population experiences disparities, we know that they are underrepresented in research, generally because amongst research, there still is a lens of a heteronormative view that is generally used for most research still to this day. Many LGBTQ plus communities mistrust medical research due to the experiences of discrimination and stigmatization that they've had in healthcare and research experiences. And there still is a lack of systematic research data collection of gender identity and/or sexual orientation to support findings, to support advancement and progress amongst the LGBTQ plus population. And the research underrepresentation further exacerbates the health disparities we've already discussed. It's a kind of like a vicious cycle. So hopefully that created a little bit of a background for us to start to build the rest of our workshop on today. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and switch it over to Kay Foley, who is our guest presenter, and we can't wait to hear from you, Kay. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I feel a little humbled by being in this group of my colleagues, being called an expert, but I will just give some down and dirty. Thank you for the introduction. I right now am right now working as the executive director for the coalition. We just launched a mental health and wellness clinic. And we had launched an LGBT health consortium that we sort of tabled so we could work on the clinic, but we are re-upping that. So, and the whole point of that is to do exactly what you're doing, right? Identify the research that needs to happen because our community is sadly underrepresented. We are guinea pigs still when it comes to hormone replacement therapy and any kind of surgeries. And to be honest, we started it when I, as a therapist working with the LGBT community, had been, referring all of my clients to Dr. Livingston, who was at UPMC, was an amazing OBGYN, because I could send all of my clients to her for no questions asked hysterectomies for over a decade. And we never met, of course, because that doesn't happen. We don't have the ability to have, cross system collaboration. So she ended up calling me because she got called out for using the term pregnant mother over and over in a health panel. And she was like, I didn't realize what I didn't know, right? And so we, joined together with other practitioners so that we could help one another with our skill sets, because clearly it's not taught enough in any of the curricula, right? We have to learn it on our own. We have to apprentice, sort of like, I love plumbers, but I think at this point we need to have it be mandatory in all of, our education. So anyone who's interested in that, please contact me after at kfoley@lgbtlancaster.org. But let's begin a quick down and dirty. I know we have very limited time. I know that most of you who are here know enough, right? And I think that that's the danger zone, when it's like we know enough and we our hearts are there and we are passionate about this, and we're terrified to make mistakes, right? We're terrified we're going to offend somebody. This is the feedback I often get when I'm like, why don't you ask the SOGI questions? Please, for the love of God, we need this data. We don't exist. So please ask the questions. It is fear that they're going to offend someone. Fear that, oftentimes, even now when we're like, hi, I use she, they pronouns, people look at me like I'm crazy, or when we ask someone a pronoun, right? And so really finding ways to normalize that look of shock or confusion and just say, I prefer to use my pronouns when I introduce myself, because it helps normalize the process for any of my clients or anyone who's coming in for research. So let's move ahead. One more. All right. So basics of identity, right? So we all share 4 aspects. I think a lot of us know this, but we do get a little tripped up with this, right? So, I saw in one of the slides, and I don't know if this is like a federally mandated term for research, but, I saw legal sex, and I would prefer that I would suggest that we do stick with sex assigned at birth when we are referring to, sex assigned at birth, right? So we all know the basics, right? Male, female, intersex, yeah. And then we go into identity. I think a lot of us understand that, like, who we are and our expression of our identity often varies from this concept of sex assigned at birth, right? It sometimes aligns with it, and that's cool, right? I'm not asking you to not align with it, right? It is about the understanding of expansion and the narrowing of the categories if we only look at the 1 to 2, the binary, or potentially 3. So, we are in a gender revolution, which is a beautiful, beautiful thing. I am seeing the kids that I work with. It's like IT work. I cannot keep up with the ever-changing pronouns, ever-changing concepts of beautiful expression of identity and expression. And so again, identity, expression, different things, right? So they can merge, overlap, but the expression is the outward appearance, right? So how you present to, I see a chat, but I can't address it. So I'm going to push that aside. So basically, expression, as we all know, what we present to the outside world, but it also, does intersect with who we are in our identity at times. And then we look at like romantic and sexual attraction, hetero, bisexual, pansexual, homosexual. And then we get into various forms of relationships like polyamory and things like that. So next slide. I think we all know why this is important. Really, ultimately, as researchers and practitioners, just above all else, do no harm, right? So the number one way to combat that is to be curious and to never make an assumption, right? So instead of being like, oh yeah, that guy over there, or I think that woman, no, I think it oftentimes should be, let's get rid of pronouns or making assumptions, right? So that person in the corner in the red shirt, yeah. I know most folks that when I do go to, Penn State, like I do know that the pop-up window when you're addressing a client, I'm not sure if that's how it all works with your research categories, but, I think people are pretty good at using that, just making sure absolutely that, you always, look at the pop-up window, make sure the front end staff, if that's the case, understands how to use that too, because that is the number one thing that keeps people from getting medical help or at all coming into, like participate in research. Next slide, please. Speaking inclusively. So again, we can get into the like details of this later if we had more time. I identify as non-binary, and that shifts and change. It could be gender fluid one day, but typically what I say, even if I'm in the midst of seeing a client on a weekly basis, or seeing somebody come into our facility every day, I will oftentimes say, what are your pronouns today? How do you identify today? And I don't think anyone will actually be offended by that when you ask, right? If they are a member of the LGBTQ plus community, oftentimes people will not be offended if you come with a curious mind and ask the questions. So where are we at with time? I think we might want to sort of wrap up, and I can help with the Q&A.
Okay, you still have about 9 minutes.
9? I thought I had 10 minutes total. Okay, let's
We bumped it up to 15. After
right.
we saw the slides,
here's my improv skills. No, I'm kidding. So then gender expression terminology, gender nonconforming, we all know sort of masculine, feminine, nonconforming, as you can tell with the title, it is really just the ability to express in a way that is natural and authentic, and is not sort of controlled by the assumptions of what it is to be male or female, or masculine and feminine. So many other terms that we could get into. That would be a whole 201. So do we want to pause for a second? There were a couple chats that came through, if we want to address that.
Sure, I'll read the chat to you, Kate. That's
Sure.
okay. It says one of the participants said also legal sex and sex assigned at birth may differ. Someone
Correct.
can change their form of or change their ID. So when collecting sex data, we need to know what we're asking. Do
Exactly.
we need original sex designation or legal designation?
Yes, that is an important distinction, and thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And truthfully, that's the only comment in the chat that hasn't been addressed in what you've discussed so far.
Fabulous. All right, let's keep going. So pronouns, like I said, we are, again, pronouns are ever shifting and changing, and it is a beautiful thing. I think in general, most of my colleagues who work specifically with the LGBTQ plus community, have a general consensus of just, we are way too pronoun heavy in this culture. There are plenty of other cultures that don't even have them. And I think it's time for us to, make a movement to move beyond, right? And so looking at other ways to identify people other than, he, she, even they, them. And I know people sometimes need a little tutorial on how to use they, them, or, grammar, the grammar nuts that are like, I don't know how to use that. We use it all the time. They left their wallet, right? That is just the concept of, they, them, theirs. And, for me and how I identify, it is just it is inclusive of all parts of me, right? So I don't identify in a binary. And then, ever growing list of pronouns. I have my designer who goes by Zay, them, theirs, which is ZEY. There's plenty of other things. And again, it's not the number one thing. And I think all of us here will agree, it is not for us to even try to understand. It is just, this is who this person is, right? It's not about you not getting how to use it. It is our responsibility to respect the person in front of us and to do our best. If we make mistakes, totally okay, right? I mess up all the time. I have, one of my dear friends just switched from she, her to they, them, and I mess up probably on a daily basis. And the thing to do is just pause, repeat the right one, and move on, right? And not make it so much about you that it derails into one, drawing more attention to the person, you over the top ally, if that's the case, you know, making it all about you and being so embarrassed or feeling so ashamed. Really, the people mess up all the time. I'm sorry, and move on. So next slide. Yeah, and like I said before, to normalize, it's really helpful. I'm sure a lot of you have your pronouns in your email signatures, things like that. I'm sure folks here are working hard to make sure that there are, you know, if it has to be, you know, identifiable categories, like clicking, you know, checking a box. You know, if there's room for other, I know that's hard to, you know, use in research. Some people are offended by that, but oftentimes I'd say the majority of people are not, right? If you can have a list and list as many as possible, and then still give people the option of identifying their pronouns and their identity, that is always, you know, like I just went, you know, into the cure dispensary and had to fill out a form. And as a professional homo, like I do still scan the environment, and I'm looking around to see, like, do they have any, you know, identifiable art or any, even just a flag, right? It's like, so the environment, but then in the form to fill out the very simple form, it did have a list of pronouns and then other, and it warmed my heart. It was a really wonderful thing. So okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so group greetings are really cringy oftentimes, and I don't know if you all have the opportunity to use them, but please, for the love of God, do not use ladies and gentlemen. Let's just get rid of that right now, right? Or boys and girls. And then, you know, typically, hello everyone, hello folks. Yeah, there's a list of others. Friends, kind of cringy to me, but you know, please feel use that other than, you know, ladies and gentlemen. Next slide, please. Outdated offensive terms. This again is obviously, you know, depends on the person. Anyone is welcome to use whatever term they want about themselves, right? But using, but intent in general, sexual preference is not preferred. It is, it's not a preference. It is who this person is. And so, you know, I would say, you know, like looking at choice or identity, depending on what you're talking about. Same thing with preferred pronouns, not a choice. So, you know, what are your pronouns? That's it, you know. And then, you know, typically transsexual, transvestite can be offensive, but not always, depending on the person. So next slide. Again, I did a little brief overview of correcting mistakes, you know, just normalize it. And I think that's the for me, like what pains me the most is that I think so much would be alleviated in our community in particular if people were just not so afraid to make mistakes. And I'm working overtime with folks to help work toward sort of interdependent accountability, right? Like this is all emergent strategy talk. So Adrienne Marie Brown, shout out, please go read that book. But like, you know, we cannot continue to grow toward progress if there's an immediate shutdown and cancel of a person who makes a mistake when, you know, like Dr. Livingston was absolutely dedicated to the LGBT community and didn't know and was like, oh, you know, so that, you know, like there is always room to grow if, you know, folks are willing to, you know, sort of ask the hard questions. You know, I know there was a request for me to talk about sort of like unconscious biases. You know, hopefully we can get into that maybe in the group discussion, but you know, we all have them, all of us. You know, we as white people are all inherently racist, right? Coming to any discussion or any situation, you know, knowing that if you are a cisgender straight person, you will not know what your client has gone through, right? And so like the term I love to use is cultural humility, you know, that I expect everyone here to be proficient, you know, and the more we do these trainings, people will be, but like humility really is that like there is always room to grow because we'll never get to a destination of equity, right? We'll never get to this destination of like, oh, finally. It's always going to be constant change. And, but being okay in the process to be understanding that, yeah, I'm going to make mistakes and I'm going to really mess up sometimes and I'm going to cause harm. But again, as a therapist, it's not the rupture, but the repair. So that like healing and progress comes from repairing mistakes in the moment or eventually when we get there, and consistent action over time. So yeah, next slide, I guess. Yeah, and so then how inclusive of your space? Like I mentioned, most places have it, but please, gender neutral bathrooms, like give the option close by. And if not, then, do your best to sort of fight for that in your institutions or your clinics. Yeah, and, we can get into the ins and outs of like electronic records and what your systems are. I have a great example of like, a big global company, Eurofins, right? And they worked with us to, well, actually, to be honest, they spearheaded it themselves, and we worked with them to, congratulate them on their efforts, to be honest. So, like this is, like researchers coming in with, having not had their legal name changed, right? So, they developed a system where they would be their, research would be identified with, like a number code, right? So they could have that. It was, I guess federal funding and federal grants. But they developed a system so that this person wouldn't have to look at their dead name every time they do their research or submit their research. So there is always a way around it. And when I hear like, yeah, we just can't, it's like, no, there are ways, and maybe it's not going to happen overnight, but the answer is not to just like, yeah, we're just going to have to accept the way things are. But I do know, having worked with a lot of school systems, things like that, hospitals, like, there are some ways to sort of preempt harm, right? So like if you're going to work with a participant or a client, and you just absolutely cannot not have their dead name, which is their, like legal name, I guess you want to say, that if they haven't changed it yet. So do your best to never say it out loud, right? There's no need to. Oftentimes you can look at a form, look at a screen and say, can you confirm that that's, your, legal name, right? And just say ahead of time, just, I will do anything in my power. I'm very sorry. There are certain things that are going to be uncomfortable, but let me know what I can do to help ease the process.
Thank you so much, Kay. You have been really, you've been so informative. I know for me personally, when you said about trying to overcome that fear of making a mistake and just doing your best, really, and if you do make a mistake, just simply saying, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's such a big hesitation on my end, I know, a lot of times. So I really appreciate you acknowledging that, and all the other information you provided was just wonderful. So thank you so much for that.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
You bet. Okay, everyone. So what we're going to do is actually break into small groups at this point. We're going to break you into these groups and would love for you to discuss research and healthcare related scenarios for when and why sensitively collecting sexual orientation and gender identity data is important, what challenges exist, and how can they be overcome. So Jen is actually going to be breaking you into some small groups, and we will post these questions. You'll have roughly about 8 to 10 minutes. We have to figure out time-wise where we are now. And we'll give you, like I said, 8 to 10 minutes to discuss this in your small groups, and then we'll come back to the big group for a short debrief. Okay, I think everybody's back now. Great. All right, so just because of time, we're going to just put it in chat. If you would like to list in the chat what your group discussed regarding research and healthcare related scenarios for when and why sensitively collecting SOGI data is important, and what challenges exist and how they can be overcome. So if you would like to, again, put some of that information in the chat, that would be wonderful, just so that we can share with one another the different times when we may have struggled or found it to be difficult to collect SOGI information and how we can overcome it. With that being said, we're going to switch gears now and actually look at the screening tool that the CEnR team developed. for collecting sexual orientation and gender identity information in a sensitive and appropriate manner. So if we move on to our next slide, we can see here that we were able to do so. The way that we were able to comprise the information that makes up our questionnaire, that we'll be sharing the questions with you in just a moment, by leveraging expert feedback from local, regional, and national organizations, healthcare systems, and leaders throughout clinical and translational science ward hubs. So we listened to the voices of the experts out there and comprised the information into a 5-question screener, which we will share in just a moment. The goal of the effort is to equip research teams with a tool that integrates SOGI characteristics that may be particularly important to determining study eligibility respective to a person's identity or orientation. Additionally, collecting SOGI data is in an inclusive way, in an inclusive way, will hopefully increase trust in research from potential research participants, particularly those amongst the LGBTQ plus community. And we know that this is desperately needed given the disparities we've discussed earlier amongst this population. So for our SOGI screening questions, there's 5 total that we comprised. These include 2 gender identity questions, 1 sexual orientation question, and 2 sex-related questions. The responses are all alphabetized to assure there's no heteronormativity bias. Most of the questions have the option for another response that may not be listed there, so that participants will be able to fill in their own responses. There's always the option not to answer and select all that apply where it's appropriate. We did also include a glossary of terms that's not on a slide here, but we will include that glossary of terms when we send out all the session materials post-session. So if we want to move to question number 1, this first question is about gender identity, and you can notice it asks, do you identify as, and select all that apply. It's important to note again that the responses are alphabetized to avoid any heteronormative bias. Select all that apply because, as Kay was discussing, that gender identity is fluid and there can be more than one gender identity for an individual. For question number 2, this is also a gender identity question, and it asks what pronouns should people use to refer to you? And again, just pointing out that there is the option to list another combination of pronouns that's not presented already and prefer not to answer. Question number 3 is a sexual orientation question. This asks which of the following best describes your sexual orientation currently. Select all that apply. And I just want to point out that it says currently because sexual orientation is fluid and it does change over time. Question number 4 is a sex question, and this asks what sex were you assigned at birth? And Kay did spend some time talking about why this is important. We do want to emphasize that we list different sexual development or intersex as an option to be all inclusive for this question. And then finally, the 5th question is also a sex question. What is your legal sex? The reason we ask this is that in some states, and Pennsylvania being one of them, people are able to change their legal sex on their driver's license. So those are the 5 questions. Again, we do include a glossary of terms as well, along with these 5 questions for the actual screening tool itself. So you will see that. The glossary of terms is there to provide terminology and definitions for all options within the SOGI data collection tool. So all those terms are defined. It could be used as an educational resource for research teams and participants. And again, it will be distributed in the follow-up materials. So with that being said, we are going to shift now to our panelist discussion, which will be question and answers from our audience. Before we do that, I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists to you because they are fantastic and well esteemed in this area. We already introduced Kay Foley, who was our guest speaker. Our next panelist is Dr. Mary Zaborskis. She is an assistant professor of American Studies and Gender Studies at Penn State Harrisburg. She earned her PhD in English with a certificate in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Mary works at the intersections of queer, critical race, and childhood studies in 20th century and contemporary American literature and culture. Her book, Queer Childhoods, Institutional Futures of Indigeneity, Race, and Disability, explores how children's bodies and sexualities were managed in boarding schools for marginalized children in the 19th and 20th centuries. She is a series editor at Public Books and serves on the steering committee of the LGBT Center of Central PA's History Project. Next, we have Rafael Santos, MBE, CIP, who is the Human Research Protection Program Assistant Director, Reliance and Regulatory Support at the Penn State University HRPP. Raphael started his IRB career at the University of Pennsylvania IRB and subsequently spent 9 years at the Columbia University IRB before joining the Penn State HRPP in April 2021. At Penn State, Raphael worked to develop a single IRB program, including development of a single IRB fee calculator. In addition to maintaining Penn State's AAHRPP accreditation, Raphael also serves as an IRB member for the Penn State IRB Non-Compliance Board. So welcome to our wonderful panelists and our amazing guest speaker. So I'd love to open it up now for question and answers, or questions from the audience. All right, Stephen, we see that you have your hand raised. Would you like to go ahead and ask a question to our wonderful panelists?
Yes, hello. Also, I just wanted to say I have the team here with me. We are in the CTSI conference room. So Abby, Sarah, Kelsey, we're all here. But my question was, what would you say, and this was covered briefly in the presentation, but what would you say for people who want to be allies and ask the right questions, but are afraid of coming across as tokenizing rather than offensive?
I spoke a lot, so I'll let somebody else jump in if you like.
Dr. Zaborskis, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, yeah. I think that, I thought that Kay covered really nicely how it's about kind of like energy and intent and sort of not, recognizing that whoever you're asking this question of, is, just another person and you're trying to, either access this information or be providing care or whatever it might be. And just that, like, that the information that is coming from a place of like, I want to make sure I'm being, respectful and making sure I'm acquiring the information that I need, right? And not kind of reducing the person to that information, and also not, I don't know, like I'm trying, like, as Kay was saying, trying to normalize, right? Not making it this like, this big deal, or I don't know if that is kind of getting at what you're saying, but I think that, as long as that intent is there of, of treating that person as a person, then that is, and that, again, this is about providing just good care, then that is, that's the way to go. I don't know if that is fully answering your question.
I think that's great. I think that, honestly, what I want ultimately folks to do is, ask it as though you're asking someone's name.
Mm-hmm.
It is not, there's no, like I mean, I appreciate the question because we all do know like the over the top ally where it's just like, oh, look at you, girlfriend, like where it's like, you're like, okay, calm down, but like the I think the way around it is just absolutely just to make it just matter of fact, and if somebody's like, well, what are you talking about? Just, I just have to ask these questions of everyone, ideally.
Great, thank you.
I was just going to add also that I think it depends on the topic, right? Like to the point of making it seem like it's kind of like a token question or answer. I think like as a gay man, you're not just going to go up to someone and ask them about their sexual orientation for no reason. Whereas when you're thinking about gender identity, those are things that you might want to ask up front so that you don't misgender someone. And so I think when you're thinking about it from that standpoint, I think it would make sense to just ask the question when you're thinking about gender identity, but not so much sexual orientation unless it's, related to the topic at hand or the research that we're discussing.
Yeah, good point.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
We have another question. Craig, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Thank you so much for this presentation today. It's been very, very, very helpful. And we do, for our studies, we have questions that we're asking, they're like inclusion, exclusion criteria. And one of them is we're trying to get at if a person is of childbearing potential. So we're asking, right now we're asking what is biological sex, which from what I'm learning here, there's other ways to ask it, but I saw in that questionnaire, we had that other choice. How can we ask that in a way that we can get the information that we need for the study without coming across that we're not being respectful?
Dr. Zaborskas, do you want to start out with this one?
Yeah, and I would be curious what the other panelists think too. I think that I guess asking question, like putting it on kind of the way that you said, like do you have, I'm trying to think, it's like not like do you have
Childbearing potential.
Yeah, childbearing potential, like reproductive capacity, right? Kind of making it maybe more about that potential, right? Than about assuming that potential is linked to, what they're checking off in terms of gender identity or assigned sex at birth. Because there's also, it's not just, persons who are a different gender than what they were assigned at birth that for whom those things aren't going to be linked, right? Like there's a whole range of persons who, were identified as female at birth, identified as women, but also don't have reproductive potential, right? So that might be ways to capture an even larger population than just those that might fall under the banner of the LGBTQ plus community that are impacted by that.
This also brings up a good point from an IRB perspective, because we have protected classes in the regulations, 3 of them specifically: children, prisoners, and then pregnant women. So the regulations are kind of behind when it comes to using the correct gender identity in these situations, and our IRB offices are having to apply those regulations that have terminology that just isn't consistent with the data that we're collecting from individuals.
I'm going to interject with a comment in the chat that I think is really just building a little bit more on this. One of the participants is mentioning that perhaps for a study of this type that we're referring to, the participant is suggesting maybe phrasing a caveat at the beginning that says, and I'll quote, "For this study, it is important for us to know if you're able to become pregnant," and insert a reason such as the medication being studied might be a risk for those who can become pregnant, that type of thing. And so this participant is curious about how US panelists would respond. And this is actually building on a comment from this participant a previous comment in the chat from the same participant who's mentioning the importance of being very clear about what you're really asking. Are you asking about pregnant capacity? Asking about female biological sex might not actually get at that question. So I'll turn it back over to you to hopefully address what this participant is looking for.
Yeah, I like the idea of the caveat if it's like appropriate, depending on like the context in which, which information is being acquired. But I think that sense of, and I this came up in it says that in one of the breakout rooms, people talked about this, like if people kind of understand like why is information being acquired, or, what is it being used toward, then that can sometimes, allow for more trust and kind of like, revealing or having to share something, or understanding what the purpose is.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to do one more question. Just because of time, I'm so sorry that this always happens. We end up being tight for time at the end, but this is a really great question that was posed in the question and answer option. It says, how often should we be asking these SOGI related questions in longitudinal studies, since some of the answers may not be as fluid and stay the same, or may be fluid and not stay the same? Does anybody have any ideas for a longitudinal study, how often researchers should be checking in with these SOGI questions?
I mean, I would say as often as possible, but that's not my area of expertise. It's what I need to hear from people, but.
Right. Thanks, Kay.
Yeah, from an IRB perspective, we focus more on how to ask the questions and not so much how
Right.
often, but considering the discussions here about, fluidity, I think it's important to consider that.
Right. And I think it's just an important element to add to every longitudinal study, at this point, that we all know if we are advocating for this, things will drastically change, and that will alter and maybe complicate your research, but it'll be super accurate and helpful.
Okay. Well, we thank you so much. Dr. Zaborskis, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I think so. Again, that's not exactly my area, but if there, depending on the length of the study, if there was some way to build in some kind of regular, regular increments in which to kind of recapture certain data, that would definitely be, I think that the fact that questions even being asked shows that there's like really great thoughtfulness going into this.
Wonderful. And I think, this segues into something I didn't mention earlier during the session that I think is really important, that question that, we are very humble in the way that CEnR created the screening tool, recognizing that, inclusivity, to be inclusive, this is an ever evolving process. And I just want to make sure that we are mentioning that what we've created, we're proud of it. We think it's a pretty good representation of all the expert feedback we use to develop these questions. However, again, we're humble enough to recognize that this is not the all-in be-all, that we will be evolving over time and things will change. And that's just the nature of this work, I think. So please, everybody recognize that and hopefully you'll understand as we go along, and we encourage your feedback so that we can make those changes accordingly. So if somebody sees something and says, hey, you know what, this question could be asked differently, this is something that should be considered also, we are thrilled to get that feedback from anyone participating today. So we're going to go ahead and start closing out for the session because of time. Here are some additional resources that you can use, that anybody can use for further reading. We also have our references listed here that we used for today for all of our resources, and they will be distributed in the follow-up materials. Finally, our last part of our session today is in the chat. If everyone would go ahead and write something that they learned new by attending today's session, and then Jen is going to launch a poll that is asking, how likely are you to be more inclusive in your research screening process? So we could see people go ahead and do that. Thank you. Okay, it looks like we have 80. Oh, we're still moving. Okay, so the majority of folks, it looks like they are very likely to be more inclusive in their research screening process. A nice amount of folks are somewhat likely, and then we do have a few folks who are mentioning that they're not sure. So thank you for that. And in the chat again, if anyone wants to go ahead and write something they learned new by attending today's session, we would really appreciate that. And I'm going to spend the last minute just saying thank you to everybody who's been here today. All of our participants, we're so grateful that you were able to attend. Please offer us any insights or suggestions in the evaluation form that will be coming out post-session about future topics you'd like us to discuss and present about. I do want to thank our amazing panel and guest presenter, Kay Foley. Thank you for all of your insights. Dr. Zaborskis, you're awesome. Thank you so much for being here today and you're sharing your insights as well. And finally, Rafael Santos, you're wonderful. And we just can't thank you enough and tell you how much we appreciate your insights and your feedback for all of these wonderful questions we had. All right, everyone, we're at 10 a.m. Thank you so much. Have a great day.